The $1 recipe garden centers won't sell you. Roots will triple pull a healthy pepper plant out of the ground at the end of a good season, and look at what nobody photographs. Not the fruit, not the leaves, the roots. On a plant that has been given one particular kitchen staple across the season, that root mass is dense, branched, almost impossible to shake clean. On a plant grown without it, the roots are thin, pale, and sparse enough to count individually. Gardeners who have seen this side by side once never forget it. And the strange part is this: the ingredient responsible for that difference costs less than $1, sits in almost every kitchen in the country, and is nowhere to be found on the shelves of any major garden center. Not because it's banned, not because of some hidden industry plot. The real reason is quieter than that, and once it's explained, it makes complete sense. It also explains why so many experienced gardeners, the ones who have been growing food for 30 or 40 years, already quietly use it every single season. Section 1. The part of the garden nobody looks at. Most gardening advice points upward. Yellow leaves get a spray. Small fruit gets a fertilizer poured on top of the soil. A wilting transplant gets more water. The eyes go to what can be seen, and what can be seen is always above ground. But the truth every long-time grower eventually learns is that almost everything happening above the soil is a delayed report from something that already happened below it. A plant with shallow roots cannot hold up during a heat wave, no matter how much it's watered that afternoon. A plant with thin, understocked roots cannot pull in enough nitrogen, no matter how rich the topsoil looks. A plant with a starved root system will show tired leaves for weeks before anyone thinks to check what's happening underground. This is the blind spot built into most of the garden aisle. Leaf feeds, bloom boosters, fruit set sprays. They're easy to bottle, easy to market, and they treat the symptom instead of the engine. The actual engine of a plant, the part that decides how big the harvest gets to be, sits a few inches under the soil where nobody is watching. So the real question isn't which spray to buy next. It's simpler than that. What does a root system actually need to grow bigger, denser, and stronger? And why isn't the answer sitting on a shelf where anyone could pick it up? Section 2. The question nobody asks in the rooting aisle. Walk down the rooting hormones section of any garden center and a pattern shows up fast. Small tubs of powder, most priced somewhere between $5 and $15, with premium versions climbing well past that for a few ounces of product. Read the label and the same active ingredients show up again and again. Synthetic versions of the natural hormones plants use to grow new roots. These products aren't fake, they work. But they are laboratory copies of something a living organism already produces on its own, for free, in a form the plant recognizes instantly. Here's the question almost nobody thinks to ask standing in that aisle. If a simple, single-celled organism already sitting in most kitchen cupboards produces those same rooting compounds naturally, alongside amino acids, B vitamins, and trace minerals, why isn't it sold right there next to the synthetic version? The honest answer has nothing to do with suppression. It has to do with chemistry and shelf life. The moment that organism is woken up in warm water, it starts producing carbon dioxide, and the pressure inside any sealed container starts climbing almost immediately. Within 2 days, a bottled version of it would swell, leak, or burst sitting in a warm delivery truck or a warehouse in July. There's no preservative that keeps this organism shelf-stable for 6 months without also killing the exact thing that makes it useful in the first place. A bottled rooting product has to be dead and inert to survive on a shelf. This one only works while it's alive and active. That single fact is the entire reason it will never sit in a retail aisle next to the synthetic tubs. Combine that with a product that costs pennies to make, and there's no business case for a company to try. So this one has stayed exactly where it's always lived. In the kitchen, mixed fresh in about half an hour, right before it's used. The ingredient is plain baker's yeast, and what it does underground goes far beyond helping bread rise. Section 3. 3 things yeast does the moment it reaches the soil. For most of the last century, the only job anyone gave baker's yeast was making dough rise on a Sunday morning. But researchers working in soil biology and plant physiology have spent years quietly documenting a second, very different role for the same organism, and it happens entirely underground. When live yeast is introduced at the root zone, 3 things start happening close to the same time. The first is hormone signaling. Yeast produces small amounts of natural auxins, the same class of hormone that tells a root cell to divide, lengthen, and push a new root tip forward. It's the same signaling family that synthetic rooting powders are built to imitate, except here it's coming from something alive. Alongside that, yeast also encourages the kind of cell activity at root tips that supports new lateral branching, which is exactly how a thin taproot turns into a wide, fibrous root system. The second effect is a feeding one. As yeast cells multiply in warm sugar water, they release amino acids, B vitamins, and trace minerals, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, small amounts of iron and zinc, directly into the surrounding liquid. These aren't locked up raw minerals the plant has to spend energy breaking apart. They're already in a form root hairs can take up almost immediately, which is part of why transplant recovery speeds up so noticeably after a yeast drench. The third effect is occupation. Yeast cells settle into the root zone and simply take up space, competing with some of the less helpful fungi that cause damping off and root rot in young seedlings. It isn't a fungicide. It's closer to a crowding out effect, and gardeners who use it consistently tend to report fewer losses in trays of new seedlings. 3 things from 1 spoonful of pantry yeast: a hormone signal, a nutrient feed, and a little bit of underground competition working in the plant's favor. Section 4. Why roots take to it so quickly. For a long time, the picture of a plant root was fairly simple: a straw quietly sipping whatever dissolved minerals happened to be nearby in the soil water. That picture isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. Root systems are far more active than that description suggests. Root hairs are constantly reaching, searching, and responding to whatever chemical signals sit closest to them in the soil, and they respond fastest to signals that are already familiar to plant biology. Hormones like auxins and cytokinins, and nutrients that are already broken down into simple, absorbable forms. That's exactly what a yeast solution delivers. It isn't introducing anything foreign to the plant's chemistry. It's flooding the root zone with compounds the plant already knows how to use, in a form it doesn't have to work to process. That's a large part of why the response shows up faster than it does with most granular fertilizers, which have to be broken down by soil microbes first before a root can use any of it. A yeast drench skips several of those steps. The plant isn't being asked to do anything new. It's just being handed exactly what it was already looking for, right where it needed it, to Section 5. What the research generally points to. It's worth being careful here, because a lot of gardening content online rounds numbers up until they stop meaning anything. The honest version is less dramatic than instant miracle, but it holds up better because of that. Across several studies in agricultural and horticultural journals over the past decade, live yeast applied at the root zone has been associated with measurably higher root biomass in vegetable crops, improved nitrogen and phosphorus uptake in both roots and shoots, and a better root-to-shoot ratio, meaning more of the plant's total growth is happening underground, which is exactly what a gardener wants in the early stages. Separate trials on leafy greens and seedlings have reported improvements in germination rates, leaf count, and chlorophyll levels when yeast solutions were used during the early growth stage. None of these are headline-grabbing numbers on their own, but they line up consistently across different crops and different research groups, which is usually a better sign than one single dramatic result. What the research measures over a few weeks in a controlled trial, though, is smaller than what a lot of backyard gardeners report over a full season. In a short trial, gains plateau fairly quickly. In an actual garden with 3 well-timed applications spread across months instead of weeks, the difference tends to compound. That's usually where the biggest visual difference shows up. Not in a lab measurement at week 4, but at the end of the season, when both root balls come out of the ground side by side. Section 6. The 30-minute $1 recipe, 3 ingredients, 1 liter of water that hasn't been treated with chlorine, 2 tablespoons of plain, dry baker's yeast, which comes out to roughly 20 grams, or about 2 standard packets, 1 tablespoon of plain white sugar. That's the entire list. Every ingredient sits in an ordinary kitchen in any town in any season. Total cost, depending on the yeast brand, usually lands somewhere between 60 cents and $1. Step 1 is temperature, and this is where most first attempts quietly go wrong before they even start. The water needs to be lukewarm, somewhere in the range of 105 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Without a thermometer, the simplest test is the back of the wrist. The water should feel warm and comfortable, never hot enough to make you pull away. If steam is rising off the surface, it's too hot, and the yeast will die the moment it touches the water. If the water feels closer to room temperature or cool, the yeast will stay dormant and nothing will happen. A reliable fix for a cooler kitchen is to boil a full kettle, pour it into a clean glass jar, and let it sit uncovered for about 15 minutes. It drops into the right range on its own without any guesswork. Step 2 is mixing. Use a glass jar that holds at least 1.5 liters. Pour in the warm water, add the yeast and the sugar, and stir gently with a clean spoon until it dissolves into a slightly cloudy, pale liquid. The sugar isn't there for the plant. Plant roots have no direct use for refined sugar. It's there purely to wake the yeast up. Without it, dry yeast stays mostly dormant and produces very little of anything useful. By the time this brew reaches the garden 30 minutes later, almost all of that sugar has already been consumed by the yeast itself. Step 3 is covering the jar, and this step matters more than it looks. Do not use a tight sealed lid. As the yeast activates, it produces carbon dioxide, and a sealed jar can build enough pressure to crack on the counter within a few hours. Instead, lay a paper towel over the opening and secure it with a rubber band. That lets gas escape safely while keeping dust and insects out. The jar should also sit somewhere dark. Direct sunlight and its ultraviolet rays can damage yeast cells before they finish multiplying, so a closed cabinet, a pantry shelf, or a shaded corner of the counter works well. Step 4 is simply waiting, usually 30 to 40 minutes. During that window, the yeast is multiplying, consuming the sugar, and releasing hormones, amino acids, and B vitamins into the surrounding water. The clearest sign it's ready is a light, foamy cap forming across the top with small bubbles steadily rising through the liquid, along with a mild, slightly bread-like smell. Once that foam shows up, the brew is active and ready to use. Section 7. Dilution, timing, and where it actually goes. The concentrate coming out of that jar is too strong to pour directly onto a plant. Used at full strength, the yeast population is dense enough to briefly overwhelm a young root system and stress fine root hairs. Dilution isn't optional. The standard ratio is 1 part brewed yeast solution to 10 parts plain water, so that 1 liter of concentrate gets stirred into 10 liters of untreated water, ideally rainwater or tap water that's been left uncovered for about a day so any chlorine has time to evaporate out. That gives roughly 11 liters of finished, ready-to-use liquid. This goes on the soil, never on the leaves. Everything useful in this mixture is designed to act at the root surface, not through the foliage. Pour it slowly and evenly around the base of each plant, soaking the surrounding soil to a depth of about 6 inches without flooding it. A mature tomato or pepper plant usually takes about 1 liter of the diluted mix. A young seedling or a fresh transplant needs far less. A single cup is usually enough. Timing is what separates a casual one-time try from something that actually shows up at harvest. This isn't meant to be a weekly feeding routine. It works best applied at 3 specific moments in a plant's life, when root development matters most. The first application goes on at transplant, the moment a seedling moves from its starter pot into open garden soil and enters a short stretch of transplant shock. A dose of yeast-fed hormones and nutrients right at that moment supports faster lateral root growth and noticeably reduces the wilting that usually follows a transplant. The second application goes on at the very first sign of flowering, which is the point where a plant is essentially deciding how much energy it can afford to put toward fruit. A stronger root system at that stage tends to mean more flowers held onto instead of dropped. The third application goes on once the first small fruits have set, when the plant needs to start pulling in a heavier nutrient load to swell everything to full size. 3 applications spaced across the season is the entire system. Going heavier than that risks pushing the soil's microbial balance too far in one direction. Going lighter than that means missing the windows where it actually makes a measurable difference. Section 8. Honest expectations and the mistakes that waste a batch. It's worth being upfront about pacing, because this isn't an overnight transformation. One application won't turn a struggling plant around by the next morning. The changes build gradually. Within the first week after a transplant dose, plants tend to hold their leaves up through the hottest part of the afternoon instead of drooping. Within 2 to 3 weeks, new lateral roots have usually established and stems visibly thicken. By the end of the season, the clearest difference isn't in what's growing above the soil, it's in what comes out of the ground when the plant is finally pulled. A yeast-fed root ball is very often noticeably denser and more branched than one from an untreated plant of the same variety, planted the same day in the same bed. That side-by-side comparison is where this recipe earns its reputation among gardeners who've tried it more than once. A few mistakes quietly ruin a batch before it ever reaches the soil, and they're worth naming plainly. Water that's too hot, anything above about 120 degrees, kills the yeast before it ever activates, and the brew will smell flat or sour instead of mildly bread-like. If that happens, pour it out and start over with fresh, properly warmed water. A tightly sealed jar is the second mistake. since the carbon dioxide pressure can build fast enough to crack glass on the counter without warning. A loose paper towel cover solves that completely. Old yeast is the third mistake. Dry yeast more than a year or two past its date often won't activate at all, and if there's no foam or bubbles after 40 minutes, it's safe to assume the packet is dead and a fresh one is needed. Storage is the fourth mistake. The diluted mixture doesn't keep. It should be used within about 24 hours of mixing, because after that the yeast population starts to crash, and fermentation can shift toward alcohol, which does more harm than good to fine root tissue. And applying it during the hottest hours of the day is the fifth mistake. Early morning or evening, when soil temperatures are lower and roots aren't already under heat stress, is when it does the most good. As for which plants respond best, heavy feeders show the clearest gains. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cucumbers, zucchini, and corn. Strawberries respond especially well during their runner stage. Leafy greens like lettuce, spinach, kale, and chard show their strongest response during the seedling and transplant phase. Root vegetables like carrots and beets benefit mostly from an early application, before the root itself has started to size up. Established shrubs, perennials, and fruit trees respond more slowly, but tend to show a real improvement in fine feeder root density when treated in early spring, before new growth kicks in for the year. There's something fitting about the best root treatment in the garden coming from the back of a kitchen cupboard instead of a plastic bottle on a store shelf. The same yeast that's been making bread rise in home kitchens for generations turns out to do something just as useful underground, quietly, for less than the cost of a cup of coffee. It was never hidden. It just never had a shelf life long enough to be sold. Everything it needed was already sitting in the pantry the whole time. May every root in the garden grow a little deeper this season, and may the harvest reflect it.